Welcome back to Discern. I am Ross, and I am joined this week by my friend Kirby Anderson. Welcome back into the show, Kirby.
Always good to be with you. Looking forward to this conversation.
So this week we're going to hit a number of topics. I'm excited to get into the full slate of them. Today, we're really going to focus on something that really developed over the last week or so with Joe Rogan and Spotify and this concept of cancel culture, which is something that we've talked a little bit about on Discern, but we're going to get more into the specifics. And we've got an article to talk through here from TechCrunch, and here we go. Neil Young has threatened to pull his music, and as of the time of this taping, he has pulled his music from Spotify over concerns that the company's exclusive deals with podcaster Joe Rogan is helping fuel the anti-vaccine movement. I want to let Spotify know immediately today that I want all my music off their platform. They can have Rogan or Young, not both. Young wrote in a since-deleted open letter viewed by Rolling Stone. Spotify bought exclusive rights to the Joe Rogan Experience in 2020 in a deal worth north of $100 million. The company has faced criticism over its relationship with its star podcaster for a number of reasons since the ink dried on the deal. So, Kirby, I know on your show you've mentioned this has been a topic we've been talking through. Can you update our audience? Why is Neil Young and some of these artists so upset? Why is there a controversy over remarks made on Joe Rogan's show? What's going on here?
Well, again, Joe Rogan is very, very popular. About 11 million individuals that are one way or another actually watching his podcast. So he is certainly very dominant in the media market. But he's also brought on some individuals, some of which have been pro-vaccine, some that have been identified as anti-vaccine, which I think is unfair because when you look at Dr. Malone and other people like that, this is a man that actually invented mRNA vaccines. So he's not anti-vaccine, but he was against some of the mandates and some of the ways in which things have been rolled out. And so if you look at even the list of the various professors and doctors that have criticized that, or you look at what Neil Young or Joni Mitchell or a variety of others have said, they're oftentimes criticizing something that probably isn't true. In other words, he's not anti-vax, although he has talked about the use of ivermectin, and he has mentioned whether or not he thinks and really questioned whether or not children under the age of 5 should be vaccinated. But the bigger issue, of course, is this whole issue of cancel culture. So whether you're looking at Joe Rogan, whether you're looking at Whoopi Goldberg, whether you're looking at all sorts of other individuals in the past, they say something that somebody doesn't like, and they're then pulled from the platform. In the case of Whoopi Goldberg, 2 weeks. In the case of Joe Rogan, they're trying to remove him entirely from Spotify. And I think what we should be always talking about is the importance of free speech. If you don't like certain kind of speech or you think certain speech is inadequate, you don't censor that speech. You have more speech. You have better speech. And so I am really a strong proponent in this idea of free speech.
And so the term has been coined, and it feels relatively new. I mean, if I look back in the last 5 years, maybe it started to emerge much sooner, but this cancel culture term has just become so prevalent. Tell us about cancel culture and what are the implications? What are the areas of it we should be concerned about? What do we need to know?
Yeah, cancel culture sometimes is poorly defined, but it has really, I think, illustrated a striking difference between the left and liberals. And a man that I've had on my program many times, Dennis Prager, both in studio and by phone, he makes a distinction. I think it's a good distinction because your classic liberal idea, as articulated, I would disagree with your views, but I defend your right to express those, has oftentimes been attributed to Voltaire. He actually didn't say that. That's what a biographer said of his ideas. But I can think of, Ross, for example, when I used to speak on college campuses in the 1970s and 80s, I would have a liberal professor bring me in and say, look, we may not necessarily agree with everything that Mr. Anderson's going to be talking about, but he's going to give you a Christian viewpoint. You've heard my viewpoint. I want you to hear another viewpoint. And that was very typical on a college campus. Is that typical today? Not at all, because the left has sort of taken over. And what's so interesting, Ross, is that you look at individuals who would identify themselves as liberal, whether it's Glenn Greenwald or Jordan Peterson or Alan Dershowitz or Jonathan Turley or J.K. Rowling or even Bill Maher. These are all individuals you would identify as liberals, and yet they're all speaking out against this idea of what they see as a cancel culture. They believe that the best way to find truth is to have a really robust interaction and giving as many voices a chance to speak to that issue. And there's the interesting thing about Joe Rogan. The people that have been defending him right now tend to be pretty much conservatives, libertarians, and some liberals. But it is interesting because here's a man that is not a Christian. He's an agnostic. He actually does programs on MMA and music and a variety of other things. One of the pictures I showed to my class just the other day was a picture of him interviewing Senator Bernie Sanders, taken shortly before he endorsed Bernie Sanders as a socialist for the presidency. So you're not talking about somebody that's, a right-wing conservative by any stretch of the imagination. And you look at the kind of criticism of J.K. Rowling and others. These are individuals that in many cases aren't necessarily Christian, aren't necessarily even defending traditional values, but even they are being canceled by this sort of leftist mindset. And so that's, I think, a real issue that we need to think about.
It's interesting that I would think coming into an understanding of the issue that this would be pretty clean left-right political. It's not really falling that clean, and again, this even made me pay more attention to Joe Rogan, which maybe is an indirect, help to his show ultimately. But I started to look into the show and I looked at his past, and again, yeah, he's not overtly conservative. He's not, but you have it being politicized as often can occur, but it doesn't actually seem to be at its core a very clean, divided issue. Kirby, can you break down kind of the three areas that we can think about this or understand? You mentioned, on your show.
Well, again, one of those is sort of a philosophical issue, which we've already talked about, and that is the idea that classical liberalism, and both liberals and conservatives would agree with this, both Christians and a lot of non-Christians would agree with the idea that you had free speech. So it really leads to the second issue, and that's the legal question, because the First Amendment does guarantee a freedom of religion, non-establishment of religion, also free speech and free press and the rest. And so certainly we would require that if an individual is associated with the government, they should have free speech. But here's the issue. Spotify, Facebook, Twitter, maybe even ABC, canceling for 2 weeks Whoopi Goldberg. They are private companies. They're free to do that if they want to do so. So Spotify has the freedom to begin to pull, as they did, Neil Young's music off. And they have the decision if they wanted to pull Joe Rogan off. But I think the theory is not so much the legal issue as more the philosophical issue, because I think it's really going to be important for us in the future to recognize a distinction between free speech in a public arena and then whether or not you have free speech in a private arena. A good example is if somebody wants to protest a particular, say, church, they have to protest that church on the sidewalk outside of the church. If they went onto the church grounds and protested something happening in the church, they couldn't do so. And the same kind of thing is if you say, well, I really want them to not censor. You really want them to, because if you have a Facebook page, if you have a Twitter feed, you have a web page, and somebody says something that you disagree with, attacks you, attacks somebody else, you have the freedom, and I think you should have the freedom to pull it off. So the legal issue is Spotify is within their rights if they want to take Joe Rogan off. ABC is within their rights if they want to take Whoopi Goldberg off. But I think we should come back to that philosophical, and as we'll talk about in just a minute, even a biblical argument that free speech is something we as Christians and the general public should endorse, because that's how we ultimately come to a better understanding of each other and how we, in many cases, come to a better understanding of truth.
Yeah, that's super helpful breakdown, and I do want to take it to the biblical viewpoint as we look to wrap this episode. Kirby, how can we view this biblically? How should Christians respond to this concept of, let's take cancel culture and put it to a side a second? You're really talking in this context about free speech, and so how should we weigh in on this? How should we think about this?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize we look in the Bible, we don't see words like cancel culture or even free speech. But does the Bible say a lot about speech? Well, yes, it says a lot about speech. First of all, we have freedom in Christ. We see that Jesus talks about that. Paul talks about that. So we do have freedom. We have the freedom to express our view, but then we have some guardrails. For example, the Bible is very clear that we should not lie, we should not defame others, we should not use foul language. So there are all sorts of verses in the Old and New Testament that sort of limit the freedom freedom that we have because we want to be good disciples and we want to be good ambassadors to the watching world. A key verse, one that I know Jim Dennison uses so often, is the idea in Ephesians where it talks about speaking the truth in love. And so obviously we have to be speaking truth, but we also have to do it in a loving way. And so if we are seen as people shaking our fist or having a white knuckle grasp on our Bibles and we can't engage the culture, I think we're going to find ourselves not gaining a hearing. And in Acts 17, you see when the Apostle Paul is in Athens, he's on the Areopagus. He's with the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. He's using common sense arguments to them to lead them to an understanding of the gospel. And our society is much more of an Acts 17 culture than it is, say, an Acts 13 culture where the Apostle Paul is in the synagogue. So that's very different as well. But I also would have to say that while we're talking about speaking the truth in love, we also have a real responsibility as believers to be salt and light. And a good example of that in the Old Testament is the book of Esther. I mean, here she could have sat back and said, you know, they're going to get rid of the Jews. That's the ultimate cancel culture, if you think about that. But no, she had a right and a desire and a motivation and really even a duty to speak out against those issues. And so when we talk about being salt and light to the world, we shouldn't hide our light under a bushel. We also see in Romans that we overcome evil with what? We overcome evil with good. So we should be very civil individuals. We should be gracious. We should make common sense arguments, but at the same time, we should do what we can to actually further the discussion. And also, we should be willing to listen. In James, it talks about the fact that we should be quick to listen and what? Slow to speak. Sometimes we should be willing to listen to somebody with whom we disagree. One, because that is a good way to be a disciple and an ambassador for Christ. But second of all, in Philippians, Paul even talks about the fact that we should honor other people as we value ourselves, because another person might give us information that might help us better understand their view, might even help us understand some fact that we didn't know as we apply a biblical perspective. So we should be people that speak the truth, be willing to listen, and gracious and civil in the way in which we interact with our society.
Very helpful, Kirby. I think, for me, just thinking through as you were going through those things, if there's ever an opportunity to open a dialogue with someone that you disagree with in a way that you can understand their viewpoints, that's just often going to be better than taking a harsh action where you don't get to talk. It just feels like opportunities to speak and dialogue and in person whenever possible. One thing I've learned is that having arguments over Facebook is often not constructive. So this is a really good overview, Kirby. I appreciate the talk here about cancel culture, free speech. We're going to be getting into some other issues this week current to our culture, as we like to do on the show. But we look forward to seeing everyone back here for the next episode of Discern.